The Gemara in Avodah Zarah tells us about this story of Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya, that he didn't miss out on interacting and being together with any zona in the world until he heard of one zona that was Me'eber Layam, that was overseas, and in his great temptation, he embarks on a journey to go see her. And as he's with her, in an embarrassing moment, Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya passes gas, and the zona turns to him and says, just like that will never return to its source, so too you, Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya, are too far, will never be choser b'tshuva, will never accomplish tshuva. Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya in that moment recognizes how low he had fallen and begins his journey back. And he begs, as we know, the heavens and the mountains, as the Gemara records so dramatically and beautifully, how Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya turns to everyone and everything around him, asking them to be mevakesh alei rachamim, to ask for mercy from heavens upon me, until ultimately the conclusion of the story says Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya comes to a temptation that ultimately ein hadavar talui ela bi, that ultimately the only one that can start my journey back is me. And he sits down and he puts his face between his knees and he passes away at that point in time. And a Baskol comes out and says that Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya was choser b'tshuva, and Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya yesh lo chelek l'olam haba. And so we see that when Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya reached the lowest of the lows, to the point where he was convinced that there was no way he could come back, ultimately the turning point was when he'd reached that low, but come to the initial recognition after trying to get everyone else and everything else to advocate for him, that ultimately, ein hadavar talui ela bi, that it takes an initial response, an initial recognition of personal responsibility. And at that point, it is just that very first moment when he makes that recognition and he begins ever so slightly, he puts his head in between his knees and begins ever so slightly that path back, then that was sufficient. The Shemayim did the rest, the Kadosh Baruch Hu did the rest and accepted that tshuva, which echoes what the Gemara in Yoma tells us, that one who is balatame, one who comes to impurify oneself, who begins that path in life, then post-chinlo, the Ribono Shel Olam, God allows him to do so because God doesn't direct where we go in life. God takes our initial response and guides us in that path. So abalitame, if one goes to impurify oneself, then post-chinlo, we don't stop him. Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't stop that person from acting in such a way. That's what's known as bechira chofshis, as free will. However, the inverse of that is habal taher misayanosa, one who comes to purify themselves, who takes a first step towards tshuva, towards coming back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then we've made that free will, and then HaKadosh Baruch Hu helps us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu assists us, and we rely on him. And so, yes, in a davar talui ela bi, that ultimately it requires an initial personal responsibility, a choice, a decision that we make to turn ourselves back to tshuva, back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But once we do that, we are not in this alone. It's that initial responsibility that we are in alone. But once we make that choice, once we make that bechira, we say, I want to return, I want to be better, I want to come back. So then habali taher, Messiah of so, HaKadosh Baruch Hu helps us return the rest of the way.